Welcome to our new series, Rebuilding the Republic, Conversations about America's Future, here at the New York State Writers Institute at the University at Albany. I'm Mark Koplik, Assistant Director. We'll be speaking with major thinkers and best-selling authors about urgent issues facing the nation, including the threat of political insurrection, racist violence, and economic inequity. We'll also explore ways to heal our fractured society and our wounded nation. I'm joined today by two renowned authors who write about the white power movement, Kathleen Belew and Seyward Darby. Kathleen Belew is the author of Bring the War Home, The White Power Movement and Paramilitary America. The New York Times called it a gripping study of white power and said the book's explosive thesis that the white power movement emerged as a radical reaction to the Vietnam War is a breathtaking argument. She's assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago, and she's working on a new book, A Field Guide to White Supremacy. Seyward Darby is the author of Sisters in Hate, American Women on the Front Lines of White Nationalism, a book based on in-depth profiles of women who have participated in white power movements. The book was named an NPR Best Book of the Year and a New York Times Editor's Choice pick. Former UAlbany faculty member, Dr. Ibram X. Kendi, called it eye-opening and unforgettable. You can purchase Bring the War Home and Sisters in Hate from an independent bookseller via a link on this screen. Kathleen and Seyward, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Many of us would prefer to think of these white power movements as fringe movements, but are they mainstream? How likely is it that some of the kids on a large college campus or the people next door in a typical American suburb subscribe to these terrifying beliefs? Let's start with Kathleen.
I think one thing that we might want to think about is that even if it is a fringe movement, I think that subscribe might not be the litmus we should be most concerned about. I think that at this point, everyone is exposed to this movement in one way or another. So on a college campus, in a suburb, in a rural area, in a city, it kind of doesn't matter where you are because these are so heavily internet motivated and mobilized that everyone has encountered this ideology at this point. And we've all now survived an attack on our democracy perpetuated on January 6th, in large part because of this movement. So we now share something in common with people who have survived attacks on their communities in El Paso and Charleston and Pittsburgh and elsewhere, and who have really been finding themselves at the sort of in the crosshairs of this kind of violence. Now, I think it is a fringe movement, but we have to remember that it brings with it a tremendous amount of infrastructure and armament and decades of social organization behind it. So fringe doesn't mean small or inconsequential.
Seyward, would you like to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always struck by this idea that fringe must necessarily mean unrecognizable somehow, that it must mean that, it's an other. And for decades, right-wing extremist researchers have been saying that's not who makes up this movement. It's not crazy people insofar as, they're all mentally unstable. It is not, all people from the South. It's not all poor people. It's actually a much more representative cross-section of white America. And so when we talk about it as fringe, I think there's a lot to unpack from that word. And I know that one thing I encountered a lot in doing the profiles I was doing of women in the movement was, there were a range of people that I talked to, some who didn't have a college education, some who had a master's degree. There really is no clear profile. And I think that that's an important thing to remember when we're, talking about, is it fringe? But then the other thing is, Kathleen was referring, I think, to kind of almost like the purest form of this way of thinking about white power. But what we've seen, especially over the last 4 years, but it was certainly beginning before that, is the mainstreaming of certain ideas from that movement. And so it's not as though a fringe movement like moves wholesale into the mainstream. It happens in drips and drabs and by threads. And so I think it's absolutely possible that, you know, your neighbor or, you know, the student next to you in the dorm or something along those lines might actually agree with certain ideas that are, you know, expressed by the radical white power movement. That does not mean that they are part of that movement, but what's interesting about it is the way that like certain threads can come out and affect the way that people are thinking about the state of America right now.
Right. So I'd like to set the scene here. UAlbany is one of the most diverse Tier 1 research universities in the nation. Our students come from every part of the state, from multicultural metropolises that voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden to largely white rural counties that voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. This is a place where young people from upstate farming communities live and learn with young people from the South Bronx and young people who wear hijabs. This is our family. Our goal is to promote the idea of one big family. Is that a realistic goal? So let's start with Seyward this time.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's absolutely a realistic goal. I mean, I think it should be everybody's goal to, you know, this country is going to get increasingly diverse. Communities are going to get increasingly diverse, and I think it's important to, you know, find common ground and make all people feel safe and comfortable and you know, given the ability to thrive in different environments. I think that, you know, what makes it a challenging goal, well, there are a lot of things that make it a challenging goal, but certainly, you know, the deluge of disinformation and the fact that, you know, people are choosing where to get their news and ideas, and, you know, you might be getting it from one place and the person right next to you might be getting it from, frankly, a place that has a completely different look at reality. And so I think that, you know, a really important piece of this goal is, you know, having an agreement about, you know, what information sources are valid, what information sources, you know, are fair. And then on top of that, I think that so much of community building is about dialogue. And I actually, you know, people ask me all the time, how do you convince somebody to leave the white power movement or to, you know, leave QAnon or something like that? And I find that, I mean, there are complicated answers to that question, but I think that, you know, the starting point for having a dialogue with someone you disagree with is often asking questions and at least trying to understand where they're coming from and, you know, what their background is, where they're getting their information, as opposed to just, you know, immediately confronting something. And so I think that, you know, that to me, you know, in a very diverse environment can be hugely helpful, starting from the place of asking questions of each other.
Right. So, Kathleen, we're trying to celebrate diversity all the time here on this campus. It's one of our core values. How do we do that in a way that makes everyone feel valued, including, for example, working class white kids or anyone?
I think that making everyone feel valued can't be the same thing as validating some of the ideology that we're talking about in extremist movements, particularly because some of these groups use campuses as fora for recruitment and as sites of radicalization for further action. And that's not to say that certain claims of life experience shouldn't be valid on a college campus. I teach on a college campus. Everybody's experience should be valid in college. It's an incredibly important part of what we do in the classroom. But I also think that there has to be a line around that discussion when we're talking about things that are fundamentally a threat to students, like doxing practices or anti-democratic conduct or harassment or things like that. And I suppose that might be the best answer that I have for you. I would just piggyback on something Seyward was saying about the kinds of social interactions that are a part of what happens at college can be one of the most powerful tools for de-radicalizing people. And I think about the experience of who came out of the movement largely through his, you know, social relationships with other people at college. And there's a lot of stories like that where simply the humanizing impact of talking to people you wouldn't talk to in another setting can be a really transformative experience.
Yeah, I would just I would also, I was thinking of something when you said, the difference between valuing and then, being concerned with what is valid. And I think that, one thing with regard to these groups targeting college campuses for, recruitment is they have a lot of positive messaging. It's not anti anybody per se. It's not as though, they're out saying we should, murder all people who aren't white. I mean, some of them might be, but point being, like, they're strategic. And so they're often promoting this idea that, well, there's a Black Students Association, why shouldn't there be a White Students Association, which is a false equivalence. But point being, I think especially people in an administrative position in a community like that have a real responsibility to know when language is worrying, even if it's seemingly positive. And when it's just trying to exploit, the rhetoric of identity politics and other things, to ends that are not genuine, frankly. And so I think that, in some ways there's a difference between how does a community have a dialogue, and then how do the people, particularly when you're talking about young people, how do the people in positions of power and authority come to the table and sort of, set the parameters of what is going to, be valid conversation.
So being aware of those false equivalencies and the dangers of the rhetoric that is used, what's the best way for folks who want to take pride in their family heritage or ethnic heritage to express that? Are there better, healthier ways to? Well, of course there are, but what are they? Let's start with Kathleen.
I'm not sure I have an answer to that, except to say that, all of these things are historically constructed categories. So I think it makes sense to have some coursework that talks not only about the construction of other parts of our society, but also the construction of whiteness and Blackness and other kinds of racial groups and how porous those have been over time. And also what those family stories really have meant. So not to be a historian all the time. And I know that when you have a hammer, everything is a nail, but history class for everybody is my first answer. I think often those family stories have a lot in them that is worthy of praise, and a lot in them that is very deeply problematic. And I think a real conversation about, the relative benefits and drawbacks that we all bring with us to college is a great place to start.
Seyward?
Yeah, I would say absolutely a much deeper focus on talking about what whiteness really is, how malleable it's been over time, and how it is not this, unlike what the white power movement would have you think, it's not this identity stretching back, millennia that, is some sort of, great natural heritage. It is a social construct. And I think, everybody should be reading books like Nell Irvin Painter's The History of White People, and other books about whiteness that really look at what it means and how fundamentally it's a measure of power in society. That's what whiteness is, and who has access to it or who's been given access to it over time, has really shaped a lot of what America is today. And I think that if you can establish that and sort of a common understanding of what whiteness is, which is, to be clear, a huge task to begin with, I think then on top of that, talking about people in terms of their individual stories, where their families came from, what countries did they come from, what communities in those countries did they come from, any number of things to individualize, as opposed to reaching for this broader category that frankly isn't useful. And not only that, can be very, very dangerous. So I think whiteness is something that, and we see lots of people studying it increasingly and, writing books about it. And I think that, treating it with real rigor and introducing students to the concept can be hugely, hugely helpful.
So some women are sympathetic to the white power movement because it glorifies ideas of traditional femininity and traditional female roles. White power is a dangerous ideology, but is traditional femininity a legitimate choice for some young women? We'll start with Seyward.
Sure. I mean, I think that certainly that choice is valid. If that's, a choice that someone wants to make, to be a stay-at-home mom, or, to have a ton of kids or whatever, like I have no problem with that. What becomes problematic is when that identity is perverted for political ends. And people ask me all the time, well, don't they realize how misogynistic it is that they're told to just be mothers? I'm like, but no, because motherhood is constructed as a political act. Being a mother is a political activity, frankly. And so I think that, we certainly shouldn't be demonizing traditional femininity. But I also think that, one thing that's hugely important, that's interesting because there's just been in the last couple of weeks some really fascinating reporting on how the pandemic has affected mothers in the United States, right? Stay-at-home moms, working moms, single moms, across the board. And I think that even when someone says, I am choosing traditional femininity, or I'm choosing to be a stay-at-home mom, oftentimes that choice is actually informed by a lot of things that have happened before, a lot of societal pressures, expectations. It's not necessarily this clean choice that somebody makes. And so I think that there's absolutely no reason to demonize it. It's very important to note when it's being used to political ends, and as a way of elevating a certain type of femininity, a certain approach to motherhood that is ultimately about drawing boundaries around oneself and one's family in a way that is detrimental and exclusionary to people who are not precisely like you. But I also think that it's really important when we talk about motherhood and traditional femininity to understand what are the actual factors that are leading someone to that choice. And I think that that's kind of gotten lost a bit in the last few decades, frankly, in the era of choice feminism, that any choice you make is a feminist choice because it's your choice and therefore, congratulations, you have power. But, what is a choice informed by? What is shaping the path that brought you to make that choice anyway? I think, taking the big view is so important.
Kathleen?
One of the really interesting things that happened in the historical profession is that we historians sort of missed conservatism completely, such that people were really surprised when Reagan was elected, really surprised by the culture wars of the early 1990s. And part of the reason that we missed it is that what historians until that point had been trained to look at was mostly great men, intellectual, presidential kinds of modes of history, or women's history, but rendered as feminist women's history, because most of the people who write women's history are feminist. So one thing that happened is that a lot of women were organizing on the ground from right after World War II all the way up to Reagan's election and propelled the conservative groundswell. And we missed it because those women were saying, oh, well, I'm not political. I'm not interested in politics. I'm just a wife and mother. I'm staying home. I'm not doing. And at the same time, they were in fact marshaling an enormous political movement. So that's happening in miniature and on much more extreme measures in the white power movement too, where you get people who are saying like, I'm just a wife and mother, I'm not political, I didn't really participate, when they are in fact like, doing everything from writing treatises to driving getaway cars. And so part of what we have to do too is to calibrate our notion about what political is, especially for women, because a lot of activism is wrapped up in these choices, right? And you can see this on a more everyday level, as Seyward was saying, right? Like the decision to be a stay-at-home mother rests on a whole bunch of things like social infrastructure, extended family relationships, enough money. And then there are all kinds of other decisions within being a stay-at-home mother that have to do with what you're going to feed your children, what medicine and vaccines you're going to give your children. All of these are political actions, even though they do not sort of show themselves as political actions all the time. So that is to say, like, of course, women can choose what I believe that women can choose what they want for their lives. But I think it would be a real discredit to women if we thought that those choices weren't political.
Absolutely. I'll piggyback on, because I'm thinking of a specific example. One of the women that I profiled in my book, who her entire raison d'etre is being a traditional wife and mother. And at a certain point, she made lots of YouTube videos and had a very active social media presence. And at a certain point, she decided to stop doing that. And she still maintains something of a presence, but it's much like quieter than it was. And if you read what her social media bio now says, it says politically retired, which I think is such an interesting descriptor, because the politics in her case have always been personal. Politics have always been about family. And so just because you aren't, using Twitter or Gab or YouTube or whatever to promote your ideas, and in her case, they were very much, tied up in white supremacy, that doesn't mean that one is actually politically retired. And so Kathleen actually was the person who, early in my research, we had a phone conversation. I remember we had this conversation about reimagining the political and kind of looking at the very sexist ways that politics and political action has been defined, and remembering and keeping that in mind while particularly evaluating the work of women.
Can I give one other example, which is my favorite one of these stories? So there's a lot of women in this movement, and the period that I study is from the end of the Vietnam War to the Oklahoma City bombing, which is the biggest violent action carried out by this movement to date. And there's a lot of women in this movement, ranging from people who are writing their own publications to people who are like the wives of honored leaders to people who are kind of just rank and file membership. And sometimes you see women in the archive who really stumbled sideways into this movement, right? Who didn't seek this out for themselves at all, but their husband got involved, and then they need childcare, and they've got all these little kids. And so they have to sort of like band together with other women. And here comes the movement, and it has marital counseling and church services and homeschool curricula. They'll pick you up from the airport. It's a whole social network that will support a lot of the parts about modern family life that people across the political spectrum find impossible. And so one of the women who was kind of swept sideways into this movement was the wife of a member of a group called The Order, which was a terrorist group that stole millions of dollars from armored cars and other sources in the Pacific Northwest in the 80s, and then distributed that money all over the place. It was a group that's usually talked about only as being a group of men. And it had a charismatic leader named Robert Matthews, who eventually was killed in a standoff with pursuing FBI agents, who he was like holed up in a cabin. They dropped flares on the cabin, and he was holding them off with a machine gun, but there was so much munitions in the cabin, it all blew up. And then he was a martyr for the movement. Okay, so it turns out that that cabin was not like a Ruby Ridge style cabin that in every made-for-TV movie, it's like this little abandoned cabin, and there's one dude in there and that's it. But in real life, it's actually a vacation house on Whidbey Island, Washington. It's like a nice 2-story vacation house, and it's full of people, and he is cooking and watching the kids, and they're like dyeing his hair so he can escape, and there's people everywhere. They're shredding documents, they're like doing things. And then the feds come, everybody gets out of there. And this one woman who had gone sideways into the movement in the way that I've described was there, right? Okay, so during the standoff, before he died, Matthews wrote a document called the Order's Declaration of War that turned out to be a really important document for this movement. It's something a lot of people cited and repeated. It became one of those things that circulated. And in a trial later about something else, somebody asked this woman, "So did you ever see that document?" She's like, "Oh yeah, I was there." And they're like, "Oh, in what capacity?" And she said, "I proofread it for them." And if you're a historian of women, you're right away like, wait, because I proofread it for them could mean like I fixed some comma errors, or it could mean like I added 3 paragraphs in the middle. So there's another real sense that we don't know how deep women's roles are in this movement, because they're also interwoven in ways that we don't always get to see the whole story.
Absolutely. I don't mean to keep, this is my favorite topic.
No, go ahead.
Another example that actually recently came into my sort of research orbit, I'm doing in-depth interviews with the son of William Luther Pierce, who wrote the Turner Diaries, and his son, who is in no way affiliated with the movement, but is speaking out now. I read his self-published autobiography, which is quite interesting. and then have been speaking with him extensively. And one of the things that he has, like in his father's personal effects, are letters from William Luther Pierce's mother. And her name was Marguerite, and she was wholly supportive of what he was doing. Not only that, provided advice for how to how to think about your rhetoric. So William Luther Pierce was a protege of sorts of George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the head of the American Nazi Party. And he was very, Rockwell, like in the 60s especially, he was very into theatrics, having people wear Nazi uniforms, swastikas everywhere. And I think he had people refer to him as Führer. Like it was very, kind of cosplay, for lack of a better way of putting it. And Rockwell was assassinated by a disgruntled compatriot, if you will. And there was sort of a fracturing of the American Nazi Party. And William Luther Pierce went on to start the National Alliance, to write the Turner Diaries, and was hugely influential, as Kathleen can certainly attest. But in this one letter that I keep coming back to in thinking about their relationship, his mother was like, you have to give up all the Hitler stuff. Like like, you're not wrong, Jews are going to ruin the world, and, white people are wonderful, but you really got to give up all of these theatrics, for instance. And later, she helped like fund various things in his organization, and he had several like mail order brides, I want to say, and she like was the person who paid for their transportation to him, like just this hugely, and that's just one woman. I should say there are other women in his life that were also like hugely influential. But what's interesting to me about that one letter, Marguerite saying, you got to give up the Nazi stuff, is that has actually been a crucial piece of the mainstreaming of certain white power ideas over time, is to set aside, you shouldn't be a criminal, you shouldn't have a swastika tattoo, you should look respectable. That has been, and David Duke certainly, is sort of a prototypical example of that kind of like normalizing of appearance, and seeming like you two can, your neighbor could believe this stuff and it's totally fine. But anyway, I just find it so fascinating that his mother was the one kind of transmitting that message to him. So yes, I feel like Kathleen and I could go on and on.
I got to say more about the letter, but we can do it later.
We can talk separately.
So Seyward, your profile of women, and your profiles of women in the white power movement sometimes makes it seem that personal identities are easily exchanged. I'm thinking of Corinna Olson. She goes from being a white power organizer to being an observant Muslim in a very multiracial setting. Are identities that fluid, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, this was, I'm glad you asked that question, because this is something that to me was one of the most like important things that I kept encountering in my research, were just how fluid people's identities were. Because I think this gets back to one of the very first things we were talking about, what does it mean to be fringe, and the assumption that you must have been raised in the movement, your parents must have been sympathetic to the movement, you must have, I don't know, I'm from the South, everybody assumes, most of these people must come from the South. And what we see is that that's not only the case from a demographic perspective, but also that people can kind of swing across the political spectrum and wind up, ultimately in a white power space. And the literature on radicalization very much tells us that the reason people radicalize has relatively little to do with their specific feelings about race, and it has more to do with their individual circumstances. And so they are people who are really looking for a sense of belonging, power, value, a narrative to explain their lives, the world, and their place in it. And this is a community, the white power community, that does all of those things and also asks relatively little of people. People ask me this all the time about, women in this space. And from a recruitment standpoint, women are being told that you are valuable simply because of who you are, the way you look, what your biological capacity is, and also the fact that, a female face on this movement can be very it can make it seem more palatable to the masses. And so, and that's, you know, not asking a lot. It's just like, be you, look the way you are. And so I think that when we're thinking about radicalization, first of all, not assuming that, you know, your political background is a very clear indicator of where you're going, but also that people who wind up in these spaces, and I shouldn't say wind up because that doesn't give them agency, people who enter these spaces are often people who are seekers in some way, that they, you know, have been looking for a dogma, or they have been looking for a community. And the fact is that white supremacy is so deeply ingrained in our culture that a lot of these folks come to the white power space and they think, well, you know, I have always kind of felt this way, but nobody ever gave me the words for it, and now I have the words for it. Or frankly, they just haven't ever thought that much about being white, because white is the norm. And this is why it's so important to talk about what whiteness is in the United States and to have a really firm historical and sociological understanding of that. But they've never had to think too critically about what whiteness is. And then they have people telling them what it is. And by the way, if you believe this, come on in. Like, we have the water's fine. You're going to have lots of friends. You're going to have a voice. And so, you know, for people who are seekers, that can be very alluring. The challenge is that it makes it hard to predict who's vulnerable and who's not, because so much of it is individualized. But I do think, you know, if people are seekers and they enter this space, it also means that they might leave if like the right circumstances are present, and the resources are available. You know, they might leave. But Karina is a very interesting person, because when I first encountered her, the way I encountered her was through a Gawker article, for those who read or remember Gawker. And I honestly can't remember how they had come across her. This is like 2010. I think an Antifa organization in Oregon had like published some information about her, and somebody at Gawker picked it up. And Gawker referred to her as a Renaissance woman from hell, because she was a neo-Nazi. She was a bodybuilder. She had been involved in kind of like low budget porn at one point. She is an embalmer by training, like all of these things that are frankly weird. But the thing is, and I spent a lot of time talking to Karina, she's, like you said, exited the movement. She's now a devout Muslim. And the thing is that, yes, those things all seem extreme, but she's also a person for whom extremity is the way that she can feel things. Like, she is drawn to things that are taboo and extreme because she has a very, like her personality just means that like she has to reach farther to you know, feel like a sense of belonging than other people do. That's not at all to excuse the choices she made, and frankly, she would not, you know, excuse the choices that she made. But I was really fascinated in her as a subject because I wanted to peel back all of those extreme pieces and look at what was fundamentally human about her and understand why she made the choices that she did. And it was wholly illuminating for me, and also terrifying because it, you know, the way that people radicalize can be subtle. It can be really mundane. They can stumble across it. They can go in sideways, the way that Kathleen was just describing. And that makes the process of, you know, preventing that from happening, you know, a really, really onerous one. So I'll let Kathleen speak to the question.
I'm not sure I remember where we started. I was really just
sorry,
lost in what you were saying. No,
over.
it's just interesting. And I'm really, I mean, like, I guess the follow-up thought that I have is that, I mean, this is why it's so important for people to put resources in de-radicalization, because we can't always catch the entry point, but there are so many people, according to the de-radicalizers who work on this, who are trying to leave these groups, and there's hardly anything to support that part of what needs to happen. So, I mean, that's definitely a conversation worth having on campuses about what should faculty and librarians and advisors do, what should roommates do when they see radicalization happening? Because what we know is that we have a permeation of opportunities and content online, and the off-ramp is going to be really important.
Is it hard to muster empathy for the folks whose lives you've you've profiled, and is it painful to feel empathy for them, and is it in any way dangerous to humanize people who have become susceptible to these hateful and violent beliefs? Let's start with Kathleen. Yeah.
You know, this is something that I struggled with a lot at the beginning of my process, because I just don't think you can't write about somebody in a historical mode without having a degree of empathy. It doesn't make any sense. You can't figure out what they were doing or what they were trying to accomplish or what they thought without taking them seriously as people with ideologies and feelings and life stories and all kinds of reasons for why they chose to do this particular string of actions. There is always a risk in talking about this kind of action. And I mean, just as one example, I know that one history of the order, that group that I was talking about before, was checked out of the Mojave County Library by Timothy McVeigh and given to his cellmates before they started the Oklahoma City bombing plan as a mode of, this is one way we could do this. This history always will have the capacity to spread information about how these groups have worked. But here's the problem. We have had now decades, generations even, of trying not to pay attention and of allowing this to go under the radar and of treating these people like lone wolves, which they are not, or lunatics, which most of them are not. And where it's gotten us is a deeply ingrained groundswell of people with a whole lot of usable resources and weapons and paramilitary infrastructure, and they're not going to go away unless we do something. They really won't. There's no reason. So to me, the ethical weight falls on the side of, we have to look at this. We have to pay attention to this. It's simply not an option. And the other thing I'll say is just, we as a society, I hope, have compassion enough for all of this, right? A lot of these people have taken aberrant action and have beliefs that I find absolutely reprehensible, but get to that place from real grievance, from real inequality, from real frustration, from real social cataclysm. And we should have compassion enough for all of that. And like I said, I really do believe that this is not optional. We have to shine a light on what is happening here if we would like ever to face it.
Seyward?
Yeah, I very much agree. And this was a struggle for me as well when I started writing about this. I'm a journalist, and so, you know, I was not in archives, and I pitched something to a magazine, and they said yes, and so began the last several years of my life. And when I pitched it to magazines initially, the reactions were interesting. I mean, I ultimately published with Harper's, and I had a wonderful editor there who was very supportive of what I wanted to do. But some people had the, why would you want to give that oxygen approach? And I don't want to do that. I don't want to give these people a platform, which fundamentally misunderstands how they communicate. They have so many platforms. They have infinite platforms. When they get deplatformed, they build a new platform. Like, it's the assumption that we in like the mainstream media are the only ones who can provide the tools of communication. Just not only misunderstands the internet, it actually misunderstands the way that this movement has always communicated, and found ways to organize and strategize away from prying eyes. So there was that piece of it. But then there was another piece of it. There was one publication, for instance, who I pitched to, and they said, yes, we'd like to do this, but really you don't need to do much reporting. Like, just go on the internet and like find some, interesting quotes of, women saying crazy things, and then we'll put it together and that'll be it. And the problem with that is you're thinking about these people in this very unidimensional way. You're thinking of them as just, okay, well, what's the most provocative thing that they've said? And you're either pointing at it and laughing or pointing at it and being horrified, but you're not looking underneath it and looking at, well, why are they saying that? What function is it serving? And how did they come to say that? And I think that, it's very much the responsibility of the journalist, the historian, the researcher, whoever it may be, to approach this topic and humanize the people involved. And humanize, I don't know when humanize became sympathize. Like, that's not actually what humanize means. Humanize means to show a human being in all of their complexity, and to, think of them as whole beings. And so you can humanize and empathize and understand without sympathizing or forgiving or allowing or anything, in that territory. It's not easy. I mean, I spent a lot of time, am I presenting this in precisely the way that will get across that I think it is bad, but also I see the logic that brought them to believe it, or something, it's almost like a mathematical equation. And I think that's why, certainly I would love to see more journalists who are very committed to covering this beat. And I think we're seeing it increasingly, more so from a technological perspective, people who are like, they call it like the dystopia beat online. And I think that's absolutely important. But then, people who are very comfortable interviewing and profiling people and not letting them say things unchallenged, not letting them, get away with lies. And one thing I always thought about in my interviews, I made a pact with myself not to argue with anybody in person or in a phone call. I just kept asking questions, keep them talking, which is, certainly a journalistic mantra, just keep them talking. Because I knew that I could say what I needed to say on the page. I could present what I had gotten from them and then counter and contextualize on the page. And I think that one thing we've certainly seen an improvement over the last 4 years in the media is coverage of this space that does that. I think that there was a real problem, particularly in the 2014 to 2016 period, where these folks were starting to, gain a real profile. Suddenly they had a candidate who, they felt was speaking for them, and people were profiling them, but they were either doing it in just kind of here's what the Nazi next door says, or they were doing it in a very mocking way, almost like, can you believe this crazy person who is saying this thing? And neither of those are helpful ways of approaching the topic. So this is a roundabout way of saying, I absolutely think it's important to humanize these people, but it's also important to not sympathize. You can, speaking with Karina, for instance, again, I spent a lot of time with her, and she would tell me things that she'd done or things she'd said, and they were horrible, and she wasn't asking for forgiveness or absolution from me, not that it's my, position to do it at all, but, I had to be like, yep, okay, that's a bad thing that you did, but let's keep talking about, what led up to that or where it led afterward. And I think that, you can tell stories that are useful for our understanding of the country and also, helpful for navigating the future without glorifying ideas, without, letting people off the hook. And I would love to see more people do it, frankly.
So our students, most of them are learning remotely, even when they're on campus, at least part of the time. And that compounds their social isolation. They're yearning for belonging. They're yearning for affirmation. Does that increase, during COVID, does that increase their vulnerability to this kind of insidious internet outreach that can happen? And what advice would you have for them to avoid those temptations?
Oh man. I'll go first. I think that yes, it certainly is a vulnerable period. The explosion of QAnon in the last year, particularly amongst women, has been, there were always a lot of women who were involved in QAnon, but it's really no surprise to me that there was an explosion during a period where people are confined to their homes. They, are feeling very anxious. They don't have access to their normal communities and community resources. And, they're maybe in mom groups online, or other, communities online, that are sharing advice or recipes or whatever it may be, or tips for how to homeschool your kid all of a sudden. And, QAnon, much like white power is a very opportunistic ideology, conspiracy theory, right? Like people find ways to kind of seep into existing communities. And here you have, communities with a lot of moms, a lot of women who are looking for a sense of community and purpose. And they're being told, don't you want to save children? Don't you want to, be a part of something bigger than yourself? And I mean, to be clear, there are lots of other reasons for the explosion of QAnon, but I think that really can't be overlooked. And I think that, from a young person's perspective, I mean, first of all, when I was a freshman in high school, my town flooded and we had to stay out of school for like a month, and then we had to go to school on Saturdays. I thought that was bad. Like, I truly am like in awe of how young people are navigating this moment and not just completely losing it. But that does mean that, you're spending more time online, and you might, find your way into communities. I don't know. I mean, I guess my advice, I don't even know if it's helpful advice, is to always pause when, you read something and it seems really provocative, or somebody says something and you're like, oh yeah, I never thought of it that way. Like, pausing and saying, but, what do I really know about the source of this information? Is when somebody says, well, I've been doing a lot of quote unquote research, and I've come to this conclusion. It's like, well, what is that research? And when in doubt, like, take it offline, take it to somebody in your life who you trust, whether it's like a parent or a friend or a teacher or a counselor or whoever you're in communication with, to kind of bounce the idea. Because so often, like, these echo chambers come to exist because people don't take it offline. They just keep going online and, reading, regurgitating. And the thing is that it becomes self-reinforcing because you regurgitate, people like it a lot. And they say, oh, that's so brilliant, I never thought of that. And you feel really good about yourself. And so, when in doubt, kind of pull yourself away and try to make, to bring up whatever the topic is, to bring up whatever, the communication is you've been having, with somebody that you really trust. Yeah, I don't know if I'm not a parent, in case that was not abundantly clear. And so I don't know if that's helpful advice at all. But I think when in doubt, step away from the computer or phone or iPad or whatever it may be.
Kathleen?
I think that's great. I haven't heard a better answer to that question. I mean, I think part of what we're dealing with here is that QAnon is really new and different and much faster than what we've seen in the past. And certainly the pandemic and the role of social in all of our lives is one of the reasons for that speed. But I also think, I mean, I would just underline that it's, if you know people who are getting involved in it, it can be very serious and it can be very derailing to people's lives. So it is a situation where you should try to seek some help if you see that happening or if it's happening to you.
Final question. What would it take to mend the fabric of our society? And are you hopeful that we can do it? So, Kathleen?
Well, I think what I would say is that the white power movement is still with us because of not just one problem, but a whole bunch of problems that go across our society, right? So there was a problem with, trying to hold trials for white power defendants in a court system where they couldn't get a jury that would convict. And then there were problems with what kind of laws we were using to prosecute. There were problems with surveillance resources and how investigations worked. There were problems with the kind of journalism we were doing and the idea of the lone wolf that let a lot of things disappear. There was a problem of public attention where nobody really was paying attention to this for a really long time. Problems of law, problems of military policy. It goes all the way up, right? So that means we need a solution that goes across all of these levels too. And the only solution, broad solution I know of that tries to look at all of those different levels of society is something like a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Startlingly, we in the United States are I think we are the only nation in the world that has had a deep, deep system of racial violence and racial inequality and has had no public reckoning along those lines. We now have a National Museum of African American History, but of course nobody can go to it right now. We now have one memorial in Montgomery, Alabama about victims of lynching, but I think anybody who's even dipped a toe in American history knows that our problems are deeper and bigger and broader than that. So white power is one manifestation of a bigger conversation that we have been avoiding. And I think we have to finally do that work of coming together and talking.
Seyward?
Yeah, I think that it's an all hands on deck situation. And that, certainly means all white Americans. And it also means like every institution imaginable, whether you're talking about academia, law enforcement, religious institutions, like just everybody has to come to the table to talk about these issues, because like Kathleen said, this starts from the standpoint of what are the lies that we as a nation have been telling ourselves for so long.
Yeah.
Excuse me. And my husband and I were just having this conversation last night, in fact, about how the United States is uniquely built on mythology in comparison to so many other countries, it seems, or maybe we just know it better. But I think that, it is truly built on so many mythologies, about the kind of society and political system that, it would build, and who it would be for. And we built so many mythologies along the way. And so, after the Civil War, we really let the lost cause concept become a dominant narrative. And if not lost cause, then okay, well, thank goodness that's over. And then we started replicating, many of the conditions of slavery under laws during the Jim Crow era. And I'm always struck by polls showing, people who don't believe that the cause of the Civil War was slavery, people who, I don't know, to this day, we still have, I know we're having lots of conversations about tearing down statues and renaming schools and things like that, but it's 2021, like it took a really long time to get here. And so having a conversation about who we are as a country, and specifically how whiteness has shaped who we are as a country, and the mythologies of our history, the mythologies of whiteness. It's truly just, having a reckoning. And I'm glad you said Truth and Reconciliation Commission, Kathleen, because I think that, I don't know precisely what that would look like on the scale that we're talking about. But I think, we have to almost create our own breach and say, we were not speaking honestly up to this point. How do we start speaking honestly now? How do we start telling truths about, who we are as a people, where we come from, the things that have happened, what we have done to each other going forward? That, do I feel optimistic about that happening? Not precisely, but I think that, I say in my book, like, history is made up of small moves, and you have to kind of take heart and feel hope about small moves. And so, the building of the lynching museum, the introduction of, new curricula about, the history of racist violence in the country, whether it's the 1619 Project or other curricula, things that are starting to, seed the ground for what new generations will understand about where we came from. I also think that specifically with regard to white power, and this is something Kathleen and I've been kind of going back and forth or echoing each other on Twitter about, is I think that there's a real risk, particularly post January 6th, of treating this like strictly a law enforcement problem.
Yeah.
Like, we need to absolutely arrest, prosecute, imprison, any number, all the things, or treating it like there've been some commentators out there saying we need to take the lessons from counterinsurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm like, did that work? To me, it did not work. So I'm not really sure what lessons you want to apply in the United States. But I think that, particularly in the post 9/11 period, we've been very obsessed with thinking about extremism as, a national security and law enforcement problem. And that is not to say that they are not, but first of all, we need a new paradigm for what national security should be, and what a threat to our security as a people is. But then on top of that, if you just take a law enforcement approach, it's whack-a-mole. You're just gonna, somebody's gonna go to jail, maybe. Some people aren't, as Kathleen pointed out, like there's not a great track record of, trials, getting the results that the government wanted. A lot of those were a while ago, but still, I think that we are a society prone to thinking of law enforcement solutions, and that's problematic from any number of perspectives and for any number of people. And I think that with this specifically, like, we have a real opportunity to say, no, like, this problem can be tackled from so many angles. It's about prevention. It's about, you know, a better understanding of history, and law enforcement is just one piece of that puzzle.
The books are Bring the War Home and Sisters in Hate. You can purchase them from the Independent Book House via a link on this screen. Seyward and Kathleen, thank you so much for joining us. Let me remind you that this and all our author interviews are posted on the Writers Institute's YouTube channel, and you can find them at The Conversation on our website, newyorkstatewritersinstitute.org. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you wish to support future programming like this, you can make a donation at our website. To our online audience, thanks so much for tuning in. Be well and be safe.